So once World War II heats up in both Asia and Europe, but before American involvement in 1941, so especially after 1939, when Germany invades Poland and Europe goes to war, the United States wants nothing to do with this. Okay? The American people really embraced a concept known as isolationism. The only foreign policy they were really concerned with at this point in time was that with Latin America. So the good neighbor policy was adopted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a softer version. I apologize if you hear dogs barking. A softer version of the earlier progressive era policy. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to roll back the idea of military occupation in Latin America by removing troops from Haiti and Nicaragua and encouraging Cuba to repeal the Platt Amendment, which gave us the right to intervene in their affairs militarily. And he focused instead on positive associations, particularly pursuing trade agreements that would be beneficial for both nations. So this is why we call it the good neighbor policy. Don't confuse it with State Farm Insurance's commercial. Now, the good neighbor policy is solely focused on economic benefit, so we don't usually stop to ask questions at that point in time of whether a particular Latin American nation was a democracy or had good record of human rights. So this is why we continued to support, for example, Nicaragua, where the Somoza family ruled with an iron fist. When asked about U.S. support of the Somozas, Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously said, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." So Americans are more concerned with trade in Latin America, which makes sense given the Great Depression, right? We're trying to get the economy back on its feet. And we really didn't want to get involved in another world war. A series of hearings in Congress in 1934 and 1935 on why the United States got involved in World War I highlighted for most Americans for the first time the role of financial ties and loans that got the United States involved in World War I. And so for many Americans, this enhanced this notion that World War I had done nothing good for the United States and that we needed to stay out of any future conflict. Because of that, the United States in 1935 starts to pass a series of acts known as the Neutrality Acts. This was trying to prevent us from getting sucked into another world war. These acts forbid Americans from traveling on ships belonging to a foreign nation at war, and it also forbid American companies from selling arms or weapons or any other materials of war to nations at war. So we're trying to avoid a repeat of the Lusitania, for example, from World War I. When the war in Europe starts, however, more and more Americans become convinced that we will eventually, even if we don't want to, get dragged into the war. After Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the Axis powers formally formed, made up of Germany, Japan, and Italy. And by the end of 1940, the only Allied power, with the Allies at this point being China, Great Britain, and France, the only Allied power still standing at that point in Europe was Great Britain. This is partly due to Germany's adoption of blitzkrieg or lightning war tactics to quickly roll through and occupy Western Europe. And Great Britain was being pummeled with a bombing campaign known as the Blitz. The Germans were trying to bomb them into submission. By 1940, Roosevelt, looking at the situation in Great Britain, had convinced Congress that we should allow the sale of weapons to Great Britain and China through a cash and carry basis. So the idea being that we could sell weapons of war, but they'd have to pay us immediately in cash and arrange for the transport, again, trying to minimize Americans getting involuntarily sucked in. FDR won re-election for the third time that year in 1940, and he declared the United States would be an arsenal of democracy. So he's still not saying we're going to get involved, but we're going to be prepared. We're going to help out our allies across the globe. This is also the year in which the first draft, I apologize if you hear that squeaky toy in the background. It's hard to do this at home with dogs. Anyways, this is really the year that the first draft is implemented since the end of World War I. Now, there were a lot of Americans who were very alarmed by the moves of Congress and the Roosevelt administration towards gearing up war production. And probably the most popular expression of opposition to the war is the America First Committee. The America First Committee had the misfortune of being headed up by many Nazi sympathizers, like Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest with a very popular radio program out of Detroit, and Henry Ford, who was very famously anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. Despite public opposition to gearing up for war, the United States accelerates their position by mid-1941 with the Lend-Lease Act. This is established after the Soviet Union enters the war, and this gives the United States more leverage to essentially lend out equipment to Britain, China, and the Soviet Union with the promise that they would pay later. There's considerable support at this point in the top levels of Roosevelt's administration for going to war, but the public remains very reluctant. The other thing that's happening in the summer of 1941 is that the United States is trying to deal with aggressive Japanese expansion in the Pacific. And one of the ways that the United States comes up with trying to limit Japanese expansion in the Pacific is to declare an embargo on oil. This is a big deal. Japan is an island nation. They don't have a lot of resources, and 80% of their oil supply was imported from the United States. So when the United States shuts off the supply of oil, which is crucial to the Japanese war machine, Japan starts preparing for war. This is going to lead to a simultaneous attack on US military installations across the Pacific. Most famously, the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, over 2,000 American servicemen are killed, 18 ships and 187 planes are completely destroyed in a surprise raid on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii, which was the center for the Pacific Fleet, the home base. Other attacks on U.S. military installations occurred simultaneously at places like Midway and Manila in the Philippines, which was still a U.S. territory in 1941. But because of the international dateline, those attacks technically took place on December 8th. An early draft of Roosevelt's famous message to Congress, where he states December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. An early draft actually included a reference to the attack on the Philippines. However, he scripted that out, and Hawaii was the sole focus of that speech. The Japanese had attacked Hawaii in part because they hoped to buy time. The idea was by attacking Pearl Harbor, they could significantly damage the US fleet. Particularly, they were looking at two high-profile targets, fuel reserves and the aircraft carriers. They somehow missed the fuel reserves in their bombing campaign, and then with the aircraft carriers, they were all out to sea, and so they were not damaged at that time. The other issue with Pearl Harbor from a Japanese point of view was that Pearl Harbor is only 40 feet deep at its deepest. So that meant that many of the ships that were attacked and were sunk were able to be raised, repaired, and sent back into service fairly quickly. The most notorious example of a ship that was unable to be raised and repaired is the USS Arizona. The Arizona sunk rather quickly after a ordnance went through into its magazine, causing a massive explosion. Today, the Arizona rests still on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and a memorial there memorializes or remembers the servicemen who were trapped and died in the sinking of the Arizona. And the Arizona still is leaking oil, which you can see if you go visit the memorial there. So, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially will enter the war the following day on December 8th, 1941, declaring war on Japan. And when the United States declares war on Japan, because Japan is part of the Axis alliance, Italy and Germany also declare war on the United States.